Hello.
Hi, Marco.
Hi. Do you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. How do you do?
So phase 2 of our adventure.
Yeah. Let us see how it works out. Yeah, I saw you. Did I tell you about these videos, or did you find them Googling?
I found them. Can't remember how I found them, but I found them. I think I Googled. Yeah, I did.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, because these are just. I would like to review that all from scratch, because it was just more or less.
Yeah, you kind of
Yeah.
needed to understand Aurobindo to really follow them.
Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't
Yep.
really for
No.
non-initiates. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, but what can I do? I mean, they have to go to read out Aurobindo. There is enough to read about it. They will have no problem in the amount of reading to find. Yeah, but I don't know. Maybe one time might be useful for someone.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and I found it. Hi, Ed. I found it interesting to sort of connect the pieces between Aurobindo and what we're looking at here. So I found it interesting from that perspective.
Yeah, it might be useful for people who know Aurobindo and who know physics, perhaps the other way around. You know? I don't know, but it is tough. So I said, oh, Geoffrey, you immediately put all the group under pressure.
Well, I must admit, I posted them and then I read and then I looked at them and I thought, uh-oh.
That's dangerous, very dangerous. Yeah. It's better always to look up first.
Yeah, but it's still relevant, so.
Yeah, of course. Hi, Marco.
Hello.
Hi.
Who do we have? I need to just listen for the first little while, and then I think I'll be able to sit down and participate. But I'm transitioning from another activity, so I'm going to let you all take it, and I will be listening attentively on this end.
Okay. I told Blake because he had not tracked the site, and he had another activity, but he was going to try and make it anyway. So I'm expecting Blake at some point. But hi, John.
Hello.
Hi, John.
Hi, John. Hello, everyone.
I love the shirt.
Oh, thank you.
And who did we have last time? Did we have anyone else? Remember?
I think Heather was here last time.
For a while, yeah.
Yeah, for a while, yeah. I didn't remind her. I didn't. I should have done that. But so she might not have known about today. She wasn't keeping track. So. So maybe just wait a few more minutes and then get started.
Marco, I enjoyed your presentation. I didn't get to hear the last maybe 20 minutes of it, but I thought it was a very well organized walkthrough of the relationship between Aurobindo's metaphysics, let's say, and the quantum physics that we've been exploring here. So thanks for that.
Yes.
Yeah.
I saw it too. Thank you, Marco.
Yes, I must confess one thing now, because so maybe it's better so, because I posted this one. When was this? It was some time ago, What is it, a year now? Or let me see. Yes, it's 23rd of July 2018, and since then I never give it a thought anymore. So I myself don't know longer what I exactly said or wrote there. So this may be an advantage. So we have to, if there's something, I have to go through it again myself. At any rate, it is obviously biased summary of an almost fanatic Aurobindonian, who is me. So obviously take it with a grain of salt, so to speak, because if you love Aurobindo, you like to see things that perhaps are not there. I don't know. But having said that, and trying to be also objective, when I read the Life Divine, especially some chapters about matter, the knot of matter, and there are also other parts that I don't remember now exactly the name of the chapters, but there are many references on how he sees matter. I mean, the hard stuff that physics calls matter, and how he describes this from a higher state of consciousness. And personally, I recognize in many parts, or at least one can find an analogy between what he tells about and modern quantum physics. His writings, you know, Life Divine was written in the 1920s, so quantum mechanics was not really born. Well, yes, you can say that. 19 with Planck, and so black body radiation. It was already born, but it was still in an embryonic state. And so there is no danger that Sri Aurobindo might have copied that from the other way around, from quantum physics, of course. And moreover, all these philosophical speculations that we have nowadays about quantum physics are something relatively modern. And they are at the times of in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, also later. There were some who made also these speculations, who were in the philosophical, foundational type of research in quantum physics. But most of the physicists, and I would say that's even today, most of the physicists are not interested in these aspects. So I don't think that Sri Aurobindo took this from quantum physics. So I find this coincidence very interesting. I mean, at least I read some aspects and interpretations of reality that are very similar to that we nowadays recognize in quantum physics. And I wanted to make a collection, a sort of summary of what he writes and what is known nowadays in physics. Obviously, one does not know always. It's difficult to say how far this is one-to-one correspondence, or if we are making extrapolations. And this is something that I would therefore let to the interpretation of everyone. But of course, yes, that was a background and the origin of this two YouTube videos. I've written this also in paper, but I did not make a proofread by a native English, so I don't give this out. Otherwise, it would be quite embarrassing for me. But the content is more or less that. We can speak eventually discuss about that today, or not necessarily, because I know it is hard stuff. It is not so easy perhaps to understand it, because you need a good background in quantum physics and Sri Aurobindo at the same time. And but if there are questions about that, or if some comments or whatever, feel free to ask or to comment.
Well, I think that the overlapping concept, which allows, at least in your presentation, for the bridge between Aurobindo's thought and the more material science, is the concept of force. And I recall when we were reading The Life Divine, that when I saw, like when Aurobindo introduced the concept of consciousness force, that was novel to me. I had not really come across that combination, and I had, I think, become I had a bias, let's say, that consciousness is purely passive. In a way, it's a receptive perceiving or receptive receiving of sense impressions and perceptions and phenomena. And in the conception where consciousness also entails force, then I think the experiential overlap is that in both a purely physical universe and in a spiritual universe, you have these experiences of force, and those manifest in different ways at different levels of phenomena. Like the force of 2 billiard balls is different than the force of 2 thoughts that are colliding. However, you can discern the similar pattern. There's some, I think you put it in your presentation, in every force there's both an intensification and there's also the dispersion. So in a field, which you describe as a vibratory field, you get objects because there's intensifications or concentrations of vibrational force. And from the human perspective, those appear as objects, but from the quantum perspective, they appear as, well, maybe that's something we could explore, how exactly they appear. But fields would be the term that comes in. So I would be curious to hear more about that, to be able to contemplate that a bit more, and know also how you see that overlap between consciousness force and the force described by physics.
Maybe, could I suggest we go around the circle and everybody get a clean start? Because if Marco starts answering your question, I'm already lost. Okay? So I need to, please bear with me. Okay? I need to chunk this down and chunk it really slow for myself. Everyone else can go at whatever speed they want to, but I just need to let you know where I'm coming from. As a non-physicist who's read a lot of books on physics, and am aware, as Marco and Jeffrey are physicists, and they're professionals, so they're coming from that perspective, and this is a very illuminating discussion and an opportunity. I hope that we can practice some kind of transdisciplinarity. Some of us have studied Aurobindo, some of us have not, some of us have experience with Buddhism or Christianity or various spiritual practices from multiple traditions. So I wanted to quote, this is where I'm coming from. I'm quoting from Eric Weiss, and we read him. We read an article of his on synchronicity and Jung. Oh, hi Blake, good to see you again.
Hi,
I wanted
to be with you.
And Eric was, he also wrote a book that was of great interest to me, but I'm quoting from this book, Beyond Physicalism. And I think this helps me to ground, and I hope it helps to ground the ongoing discussion. He says, consider the following sequence. I begin sitting at my desk and trying to work on some obligatory paperwork. I get bored and begin to daydream. My mind is now 1,000,000 miles away. I fall asleep and begin to dream. My dream might start out as an experience of a world very much like the waking world, or it could be a more normal type of dream in which the reality is quite different from waking life. Also, I might awaken within my dream so that my dream becomes lucid, and I find myself in the dream while my waking mentality intact, so that I can remember having been awake, anticipate reawakening, and can think about the dream world around me in a critical way. He goes on to say, I call the worlds that we experience in dreaming, lucid dreaming, and life after death the transphysical worlds. The transphysical worlds are worlds that are fully actual, but which cannot be found anywhere in the physical world as defined by physics. He goes on to say, he says, finally, I can cross over into a full dream. If my attention is properly tuned, I can find myself lucid in the dream world. Since all of these experiences can come about merely by shifts of my attention, it seems plausible that I am already having experiences in a dream world even while I am awake. Only the vividness of my sensory experiences and the training of my mind to a way of thinking that is closely adapted to waking life keep me from noticing this other range of my experience. And this is very helpful for me to orient to what the physics, the classical worldview, the new physics that's emerging, the various narratives that many physicists are using. And I just want to quote another physicist, Bernard Castro, who identifies himself as an idealist, which is actually pretty rare among physicists. And he wrote a book called Materialism is Baloney. And he worked at he worked on the Higgs boson in the 90s in Switzerland. He says subatomic particles are not real concrete things. Subatomic particles are convenient fictions that help us explain the behavior of our measuring instruments. You do not see quarks, muons, gluons. What you see are ticks, bips, lines in measurement equipment. The particles, the subatomic particles, are a theoretical tool, a model to explain the behavior of measurement equipment. He goes on to say, a subatomic particle is a histogram on a computer screen in a control room. Behind it are electrical impulses. And he says all of this is very well designed, but it is a fiction. So with those two examples, Eric Weiss, talking about lucid dreaming and out-of-body experience and alternate ways of knowing, saying many of these experiences are debunked by hardcore materialists who draw upon maybe variations on classical or the new physics. And then what this Bernard Castro, who is himself a physicist, and identifies as an idealist and anti-realist, and debunks mainstream materialist physics. So anyway, I have a lot of things to add, but I just wanted to put that on the table and hopefully get a response both from our professional physicists here, if there's anything useful in that, and everyone else wants to chime in. I'm very curious about where would you guys, each of you, like to start? Thank you.
So thank you both. I had thought that we might just recap what we did last time before jumping in. I mean, we've sort of jumped in off the deep end, and that's a good thing. It means there's lots of interest in the subject.
I need someone to rescue me, though. I feel like I'm in way too deep.
So I'm not going to go over the experiments the way we did the last time. I think I'm going to take that as a given. But I did want to recap the sort of I mean, I think here we're maybe talking about entanglement, but we're also talking about a broader quantum understanding of the world and not just entanglement, perhaps. So that's a first comment. I mean, entanglement is a central part of quantum mechanics, but it's not, you know, if we talk about Heisenberg's uncertainty principle or this discussion about quantum particles that you just raised, John, which is also relevant about the sort of theoretical fictions going on in all of physics, not just quantum physics in a way. So that's then the other that I've been thinking about this the last couple of weeks, and the two elements about quantum entanglement that limit its application beyond the quantum realm and that are controversial, if you like. If you start to talk about entanglement in the spiritual sphere, but in any sort of normal human sphere, and we went over this last time, it's controversial because most physicists believe that these effects vanish at the level of human interactions. They are present at the micro level, but they get washed out at the level of the macro level. The argument of Arthur Wendt and other writers like him is, or theorists like Penrose and Hameroff, are that there are mechanisms that stop the washing out in terms of consciousness that may be in play, but there's no conclusive proof of it at this time. There's a lot of discussion about it, but not a lot of concrete support for it. So that's a first comment. The other major limitation on entanglement, at least, perhaps not all quantum aspects, is it is not a means to transfer information faster than the speed of light, which many people assume because this effect of instantaneous reaction, and the instantaneous reaction is real, but it's not a way to transfer information. And there's been a lot of work done by the physicists to test this. And so far, it's always reaffirmed Einstein's limit of the speed of light to stop information transfer. So, and when we talk about information here, we're talking about, if we go back to Bateson's idea, a difference that makes a difference is what information is. So you can't affect things instantaneously across space. You can't affect things in a way that makes a difference. That's the issue, right? So that's the other limitation of this. So quantum physics gives us a way to think about the world that's very different from our everyday life, but extending this way of thinking as a metaphor one can do without any problem. But if one were to start inferring actual physical consequences of these ways of thinking, one can get into trouble with the existing science of the matter, right?
Except that there's a ton of research from the Pear Institute and many other places that show exactly that instantaneous information transfer. Lynn McTaggart does quite a good job of distilling that for non-physicists.
It's controversial, though. It's not.
Yeah, for sure, it's controversial, but it doesn't mean there isn't,
agree.
within a scientific tradition, a strong arm that's showing something quite different and very suggestive of a whole other realm of human existence.
I agree. Now, the other thing, of course, is because Wendt raises these arguments about the analysis is in linguistics and decision theory and these things which show quantum effects at the macro level. So I'm not arguing that there aren't any evidence, but it's not conclusive evidence at this point.
Well, actually, the most conclusive evidence is from parapsychology research, which shows people's capacity to do remote sensing across space and time with remarkable effect. And it's not just limited to, specialized clairvoyance or people who have particularly strongly developed intuitive capacity. They've done thousands and thousands of studies, very carefully peer-reviewed, to show that people's ability to sense across space and time instantaneously is much more developed than we usually give credit for. And those folks are often turning to quantum understandings to make sense of those phenomena.
My understanding is that anyway, I'm not sure I want to get into a lengthy discussion about evidence right now, but
yeah, I'd like to hear from everybody. What where would you guys want to start, Ed?
One of the things, I just wanted to finish what I was saying. One of the things that I thought about in the intervening interval is that that we assume that the world is information and that everything is done through information. And I'm not convinced that's the case. I think there are other parts of what's going on in the world that are not informationally organized. And the quantum arguments the arguments about propagation of information faster than light or instantaneous or whatever apply to information, but they don't apply to other parts of our experience that may not be information based. So that's the first comment, because I think some of what's going on in the spiritual realm have to do with experiences that are not necessarily communicable in information terms. And in that sense, perhaps we're not bound in the same way for some of those experiences. So maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah, can I throw in something? I'm pretty open about this whole thing. As in the first session, I'm kind of here to listen to what everyone has to say. I don't have a lot of problems with a lot of the conundrums that all of this throws up. I'm just kind of willing to suspend my belief or disbelief, as the case may be, and see how things unfold, in the discussion, in the evidence that's presented, how it's presented, how people interpret whatever they consider to be evidence or not evidence. I personally have a strong leaning towards analogical thinking. I like to think in analogs and say, well, this could be like that, and that's kind of like this, and it helps me make sense of things. So I'm not hard over about where we might start or not start on the one hand, because I think it's in the discussion itself that a lot of these things come out. I have an inherent, my fundamental natural curmudgeony tends to make me a bit skeptical about almost everything. But on the other hand, I've had enough experiences in my life that call my curmudgeony into question. And it's those, and that's what I always kind of hold in reserve and say, okay, well, what's being said that affects that relationship I have to my own skepticism. So I would agree with Jeffrey. What we take as evidence is what we believe it to be. There's a whole lot of belief that's involved in this, and I don't think that most people are very clear on what it is that they believe compared to what they know. And that's not a criticism. That's simply an observation at this point. I work very hard at trying to sort out the differences between what I believe and what I know. We had in the last cafe, we had a kind of a little interlude about that, because I have some beliefs that are actually very limiting, and I know that they're limiting. John will recall that the discussion we had there, but I don't take that as something that's actually holding me back. It's simply part of that skepticism that I just bring to life in general, because I like to move forward slowly. I can see a lot of similarities between what I read in esoteric and spiritual literature and what I read in quantum physics. But I'm neither a physicist nor an adherent of any real, let's say, spiritual school of thought. So to me, it's all right. I see the analogies. I see how that can be connected. Where are the arguments? Where are the ideas? Where are the thoughts that are coming up that make those connections stronger and allow me to work with those connections in some way that becomes meaningful for me? So that's why I consider myself more of an observer here than a contributor. And since it's all in this field of probability, where you put your finger and start really doesn't matter to me, because it'll whatever it is, it'll unfold from there, because that's kind of how I see things operate.
Thanks, Ed.
Yeah, thank you, Ed. I would like to take this up immediately, because I think this puts the frame on the whole thing. Because what you said I like very much when you say we are not clear about what we believe, or in what we believe. In fact, what I always say, it is not wrong to have a belief system, eventually also a strong belief system, weird, out of mind belief system, if you wish. But the point is, we must be aware that it is our belief system, and where the hard facts and our beliefs begin to creep in. As long as we are aware of this, it's okay to have whatever kind of belief. But the problem is, especially scientists, I mean, now the die-hard materialists are not aware of that. They have just their belief, materialistic belief, which is not wrong either in many respects. I must say, sometimes I feel more comfortable among die-hard materialists than spiritualists, because at least they have some logical way of thinking, and you can make a rational argument. Their limit is that they don't see that they have a belief system as well. They continue to tell you, well, what we say is just science. But they don't see where they have already a theory which is laden, which is heavily laden also with their own assumptions. Yeah. So this comes I agree very well with this. And in fact, that is what perhaps we are trying to do here. And I like this group, because we are more or less, I think, aware that we are jumping here and there, maybe also stumbling, but we know this is a tricky thing, and we must be very careful. And here, again, also agree with Jeffrey, where you say information, this idea of information. The question is, when we talk about information, this is something physicists also seem not to be much aware of. What is information? When they say that everything is information, everything, now there's a recent, well, perhaps it's not so recent, but it's again in fashion, this idea that the whole universe is just a huge giant computer, a number crunching machine that is making a simulation, a cosmic simulation, and everything therefore is just information, an elaboration of information. But what is really information? What do we mean by information? And then you see that in physics you have also a very precise definition of what information is. It's the so-called Shannon entropy and so on. But they are not really speaking about that. But when you point them out, that you are not talking about the Shannon information, which is a very down-to-earth, rigorous definition of information, but when it comes to the philosophical aspect, is not very helpful. And then you see that they are in a crisis. So everyone is speaking about specific things, just what is information, everything is information. And when you ask, consciousness, what is consciousness? And there are thousands of definitions about what consciousness is. And you see that, well, a lot of people, when they talk about consciousness, they can't agree, not because maybe they kind of more or less agree, but they are talking about something completely different. They have one conception about consciousness, the other has another conception of consciousness. When I speak about consciousness, I speak about that experiential, subjective phenomenon that can't be explained because there's this so-called hard problem of consciousness. But you can define consciousness in very different ways, and when you speak with a lot of psychologists, consciousness is just seeing you in the mirror and recognize yourself. That is self-consciousness. Okay, but this is not very helpful in this kind of domain. So, in fact, we must be very careful to see what is a metaphor, what is an extrapolation, and what effectively hits the nail, so to speak. And this is exactly that, because this in the physical domain corresponds to this spiritual experience or spiritual description of the world, of the cosmos. And that's a minefield, a very minefield. Nevertheless, extremely fascinating. And since I'm a physicist, but at the same time have my spiritual inclination, I like to, and because I can't believe that these are completely two different subjects. On one side, there is a physical universe that we perceive with our mind and our senses, but intuitively somehow we feel that there is also another universe, and these must somehow connect. So quantum physics is maybe one of the many points of conjunction between these two universes, and might tell us something. The problem is to see where the real phenomena ends and the metaphor begins. And that's our yeah.
But hitting the nail on the head, Marco, is a metaphor.
Yeah.
And I think the metaphors that we use and the stories that we use to tell stories and to generate metaphors is infinite.
Yeah.
And I don't think we're going to, and I think that's it's glorious and it's problematic. So I'm agreeing with you there. But I think this fact value distinction cannot be easily labeled and dismissed, because our values determine what we call a fact. And as Tim Morton, the ecologist, says, there's a difference between a fact and a factoid. And we're being bombarded by factoids, which are like facts in drag, actually, by a lot of half-ass science that's isn't completing distinctions, but is rushing to the press anyway. And so I think it takes a lot of vigilance for each of us and all of us to sort through what we read and to figure out the difference between information and news. I know if the Wall Street Journal says the commodity price is this, and the Wall Street Journal or another magazine says the price is this, that's information, but it isn't news if I already know it. So I think this is a challenge for me as I enter into these zones where I'm not an expert, but the experts are not in agreement with one to sort out the facts from the values. And absolutely, let's be mindful of our metaphors, because some metaphors are really lousy. But I don't know if you're going to be able to eliminate metaphorical or analogical thinking and still do science, because science is a product of culture and language, just as every human endeavor is. And also something that Marco mentioned about consciousness as passive. Not you, Marco Massi, Marco Morelli. He initially said something about passive, consciousness as passive, and then there's consciousness as force, and consciousness does lots of stuff. And I think that consciousness as passive is sort of instilled in us by sitting in cushions in a lotus pose and spacing out and calling it transcendence. I think there is transcendence, and then there's pseudo transcendence, and lots of it. But I think that's I think that's something we could explore even further. And this something that was brought up about Alexander Wendt and Penrose and Hameroff, and what scales up. Does the quantum level, does it scale up into the biotic? I'm really open to that possibility, but I also see that that there's a lot of problems with that. But I'm also reminded of this of a bird. I can't remember the species, but it was studied, and there's a YouTube video on this. But and I don't exactly remember what the experiments were, but they don't know how this bird flies the long distances that it does and always arrives at a destination when it has a teeny tiny little brain. And this is a mystery, but they concluded that this bird has something like a quantum transformation happening, so that it can be connected to the center of the Earth and fly these great distances with, with so much accuracy. So there's a whole lot. We know a lot, but there's a whole lot that we do not know. And there may be a whole lot that we will never know. So we're really walking where I think Bateson says angels fear to tread. But I think this has real world consequences if we diminish ourselves and say, oh, this isn't possible because the physicists say it isn't possible. If you've had an out-of-body experience, or a lucid dream, or a telepathic communique, or, 100, all kinds of paranormal experiences, which I don't think are that paranormal. I think they're normal. I just think they're underreported, and maybe people are embarrassed because they don't know how to, they don't have adequate descriptions that they can share with others. We don't have an adequate vocabulary to make assessments or evaluations. And I think that's probably why so many, the field of the paranormal is so hard to study in laboratory conditions, because most laboratory conditions are restricted in ways that would definitely inhibit anyone who has a capacity for psychic or the paranormal. So those are some of the things that are coming up for me in our discussion so far. And I want to add something to this. And oh yeah, this is a little drawing here. I don't know if you can see this. Hold on a second. I don't know if this is visible at all in this light, but I'm interested in, there's the third eye. This is a guy with 3 ears. I'm interested in, this is the imaginal realm, the relationship between the third eye and the third ear, which is different from, but related to, the physical eyes and the physical ears. Just as, bear with me here, I know this isn't a PowerPoint demonstration, but looking at notes and tones, you have musical notation, which is written down. And if you read music, you can silently read a whole score that way. But then there are the tones, different tones that are made in a sequence. This is where melody comes from. the different tones in the sequence, though, there's another level, a level of the in-between, which is able to detect the relationship between the tones. So this interplay of those levels between the sequence of the tones and that capacity to hold the tones in memory, so that a melody or a meaningful that sequence can become meaningful and aesthetically pleasurable. That's that interplay. So I think it's when we're talking about symbols and we're talking about signs and signals and language, it gets very, very, and the entangled nature of our minds when we share a language. I am of the opinion this is a belief. It's a belief that comes from actual experience. That our language actually assists us in modeling reality, and that we can co-create new realities by the questions that we ask. This is also something that Hammeroff and Penrose said, and I think Kastrop does as well, that that there may not be an objective, anything objective out there that is independent of an observer, but that our words are used to help synchronize our social worlds. But that reality is what you bring to it, and what that which is out there brings to that occasion. So it's definitely deeply relational. And also, I'm just going to share a personal experience, which I hope grounds this a little bit. And this happened September 7th. And I'm using a particular meditation at night. I meditate at night, and I intentionally use Yoga Nidra, night yoga. And I feel the vibration. It's in the inner ear, and it's quite loud. It sounds like a diesel engine inside of your eardrums. And then I lift off, and I'm in a lucid space, and there's a crowd of people there, and there's a sense of appreciation. But then I realize I have an intention, and I don't want to lose this opportunity. I rise in the air, and I address unseen presences, and I say, I want to speak to all of those that I have known and express gratitude, and to let you know that I am still here. And what I meant is I am still here on earth, whereas they are not on earth, the ones that I am addressing. Then what follows was very odd. I see two entities. One of them has hermaphroditic qualities. This entity actualizes a phallus. It's a bare body. I mean, it's a humanoid shape, but and there's also, the phallus disappears, and there's just a smooth pubic area that has no genitalia, male or female. And this kind of freaks me out. And it makes me very wary, because I am unsure of what this entity could be or could become. So now that we're in the midst of the last time we talked about Donna Haraway and post-humanism and transhumanism and all the variations on that, and anti-humanism, I sense that this image, this entity, is a kind of sign, and perhaps a symbol as well. And I also am a sign. When you get into these lucid spaces, you realize that this is very, very fluid dynamic about what is an identity, and what is the other is extremely negotiable in ways that are not so in the physical social spaces. And I think that's the benefit of being able to go in these in-between spaces from a physical, biological, socialized person to these subtle realms where a different kind of body, a dream body, a subtle body, a hybrid body perhaps, it's language in many different ways. And there's an interplay that I think happens between the subtle and the physical, which is of enormous fascination for me. And I actually believe it has survival value. Thanks.
Yeah, Geoffrey, John, I agree with you that words create our reality, and reality creates our words, and that there is this interplay. I agree also that metaphors are always ineliminable. You cannot eliminate them as long as we communicate with words. These are symbols. What we see are symbols. A mental transcription. Also, when I see this table, it is, after all, a mental transcription of a conscious experience, which, after all, is what we perceive by that is also a symbol. But we must be able to know here again, and just to bring this back into the domain of quantum physics, where the metaphor ends and is not ends, but where this metaphor is useful, or when it stops and hampers your understanding, your intellectual understanding, your evolution, if you wish. You just made previously an example of this very down-to-earth quantum physical example with the subatomic particles as a fiction. This fiction was useful for physics for more or less all the last century. And from the practical point of view, it is still very useful. We had this idea of particles as, after all, a very classical idea of marbles hitting each other. Well, finally, without asking ourselves the interpretations of quantum physics, the interpretations of what the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is, entanglement, and so on and so forth. We just shut up and calculate. This brought us the standard model of particle physics. So in a certain sense, it was a fiction that was useful. But I believe that just this fiction of believing that there are particles, and as we imagine it, as we imagine with this metaphor, with this fiction, is now becoming something that is hampering the continuation of the new physics. Because, they are now searching for a unification of physics where there are also other forces, where also gravity is contained, the so-called quantum gravity theories. And I think one of the problems of modern physicists that they insist of thinking of these objects twirling around and bouncing together, and when they use calculations, they don't have such kind of model. But in their mind, in the background, always this model continues to frame their thinking. So metaphors, we cannot eliminate them, but we must here also be able to know where the limits are. Like beliefs. Beliefs can also help us, even also wrong beliefs, but you must be able to know that it is a belief, and here also. And sometimes we do not know. To answer the question, which was the first question, sorry, Marco, if I answered from the end and coming up back to the first question about the difference of consciousness force in Sri Aurobindo and in physics. And that was one of the things I most liked in this interpretation of Sri Aurobindo of the spiritual or supramental realization of what matter is in comparison to physics. But to understand this, also the difference between active and passive, I think we must make this shift of perspective, where in most of the cases, Sri Aurobindo, especially when he speaks about this consciousness of force, he does not speak of a consciousness of a human being or of an individual, but he's speaking of a cosmic consciousness that identifies itself in itself by self-division, by discriminating in itself. So a particle, so to speak, in the view of Sri Aurobindo, a particle is just this active consciousness is made through an act of consciousness, concentrates in itself in one point in space and time. But this is a cosmic consciousness. It is not the human consciousness, mind consciousness. And this cosmic, by concentrating itself in one point in space and time, that is, in the view of Sri Aurobindo, as I understand him, a particle, a physical particle. And if you see the things from this perspective, where you have this consciousness force, which can be also passive, but can also be active in this space and time setting, by an act of concentration, then you can see many things that you have in quantum physics. The uncertainty of Heisenberg, for me, can be also interpreted in this sense. It's just an interpretation, but I don't claim that it is that, but the metaphor fits at least, and maybe it's more than a metaphor. That you have this idea in quantum physics of the uncertainty principle of Heisenberg, where you cannot, where particles are no longer particles. They are objects that are smeared out in space, at least in space, perhaps also in time somehow, but certainly in space. And you have not just a marble, a point-like object there or there or there, but it's something ubiquitous which decays then in space exponentially. But in a certain region of space, you cannot tell where this object is, which we may call the electron, but not because we don't know where it is, but it is because it is in itself something very costly, so to speak. And that you can, I see this by extrapolating as consciousness that concentrates in itself, differentiates itself in space and time, but remains somehow not really definite, because it is infinite. So how can it becomes point-like, but almost. Okay, this last part is my extrapolation. But so consciousness force is in fact the action of a cosmic consciousness in the cosmos. If you see this from this perspective and not from the individual consciousness, I think lots of things that Sri Aurobindo says makes, at least for me, a lot of sense.
If you don't mind me following up on, I always hesitate about how much I say and how much I listen. I wanted to say hi to Michael, who's joined us. I like your approach, Marco, and I also think maybe I'm pushing what you're saying a little bit, but I think everything, your sort of understanding of the spiritual manifestation of the world in these particles and fields, right, is, in a sense, it's there's nothing extra needed. I mean, physics, if it works right, gives you the means to describe all of these phenomena, right? Including the ones that, Johnny, you're talking about, right? Even though today we are in agreement, there is no clear explanation for paranormal type phenomena. Now, one of the things I wanted to say about that is, I think entanglement is a potent mechanism for explaining, or perhaps leading us into issues of paranormal phenomena, but not in its instantaneous properties, but rather in its, because, okay, so I'm going to make a statement about my beliefs, if you like, about the way the world, it comes from my background as a physicist. And in physics, if you've studied Einstein relativity theory and all of these things, physicists in general have a profound belief that, so this limit of the speed of light is that if you break the limit of the speed of light, you essentially come up with an inconsistent universe. The universe doesn't logically, physically hang together properly anymore. It's such a fundamental thing about the way the universe works that there's no easy way to break it and tear it apart. Not that I've never seen a way to do that, and I tend to think it's not possible. And that's a belief, right? There may be ways to do it, but I don't believe in them. So so it's why I'm fascinated by the whole issue of entanglement, because the entanglement happens instantaneously, but the information has to be, so entanglement is really in a quantum physical way, two things. It's the instantaneous effect, which has to do with measurement, right? It's the instantaneous propagation of a measurement result from one place to another, combined with the slower propagation of information. And it's the combination of those two that give you a significant result, that might explain, for instance, certain paranormal effects, but you don't need the faster than light property to explain those effects. You just need the combination of entanglement with existing ordinary physical effects in order to get something out of it. So I'm not sure that I'm being very clear about this, but I don't think we need to get hung up on the instantaneous property, because within the Earth, any propagation of information at the speed of light is within less than a second. We're in milliseconds. It doesn't really make a lot of difference, and it's very hard to catch whether or not you've had a propagation of a signal in a way that breaks the speed of light barrier when you're studying within the Earth, unless you're in very precise laboratory context where you can measure these things at a fine level. And in human terms, I don't think we have to worry about that. So the instantaneous part isn't that important. It's the fact that it happens at a distance and then gets combined with regular information. And so I think, so coming back to the sort of paranormal issues, we don't have a good theory for that. But I do think entanglement possibly provides the basis for a theory that would allow us to address those things in a way that is potentially compelling. So I have no, I think the work needs to be done on that. So that's one issue, but it's not the issue of, which I think is what Marco Mazzi, what you're addressing, which is how quantum physics and spirituality connect together, as opposed to through particular phenomena, such as paranormal phenomena. That's a different, I see that as a mechanism issue that would have to be eventually unraveled as the mechanisms. But in terms of God consciousness within the universe and how we connect with God consciousness, I think that's a different issue that's more built into the kind of vision or perspective that you were putting forward, Marco, that essentially, and Wendt talks about in his book, this idea that consciousness in some level is built into the bottom of the universe. It's not something that emerges through complexification out of dead matter. It's there all along, and all matter is alive in some sense. I think this is a fundamental change in the way we are understanding the material world and its connection to the spiritual. And in that sense, quantum physics and entanglement lead us into that kind of perspective. So I'm not sure if that's very clear, but
yeah, I might pipe in here because I gotta leave soon, but really intrigued by where this is going, because that was a piece of Alexander Wendt's book that we discussed last time that particularly intrigued me. His basic argument that consciousness is either all the way down or it's not at all. Putting a material bound on it doesn't seem to stand up to the various arguments that he is able to marshal around all of this kind of exploration of what is consciousness in its material base. And it raises some really fascinating questions then about instantaneous forms of communication and the notion of the relationship between a local and what some call the non-local mind that David Bohm and others talked about, but that really, I think, and even some of what Joe Dispenza says about the role of the pineal gland as a kind of antennae for picking up information in the quantum field, and the role of presence and actuating that is, I just find that all very fascinating because it suggests a very different basis for being and operating in the world than matter to matter kind of Newtonian physics, and huge implications for how we do pretty much everything, including social change work itself. So that's where I get really turned on and intrigued by what the potential implications of these are. And yes, absolutely complicated by all the stuff we've been discussing about what is evidence anyway, and is science really anything other than just one way of knowing? And if so, how do we align it or think of it in relation to other ways of knowing, like indigenous ways of knowing and global south ways of knowing and spirituality and other aspects? Is there even such a thing as objectivity? And if so, or if not, what are the implications of that? And yeah, we could jump down many different rabbit holes with all of this stuff, but I find it really intriguing.
Michael, were you going to say something? I haven't heard your voice yet.
Well, this is interesting, John, and I'm glad you asked me, because I was actually grokking you guys as I was away. I was in a different virtual screen of what are they talking about, and what is there plenty of grokking going on in this strange subject. And I can tell there is. I'm really intrigued by what everybody has just said. Speaking from my body level, I've had some experiences of trying to deepen my understanding of vibrations, and especially vibrations being movement and certain sounds that go through me. And I was in Trader Joe's, a store, and I walked to get something, and a child screamed, and the vibration of that voice just cut right through my nervous system. And I immediately thought of, in quantum, the wave interference of me coming in contact with the child's voice and vibration and how it affected my body. And of course, I was able to just be with it. So I guess to contract this down is, I think before I got here, I was walking around being really entangled with you guys. Thank you.
Just to toss one or two more things in, I mean, the whole concept or the work that's been done to understand how entrainment works and coherence and decoherence and how an energetic kind of presence of coherence actually entrains decoherent other energies into coherence is fascinating.
I would just add to, and picking up on Michael, your contribution of the vibration, your physical experience of vibration. I've been singing, and I've been trying to learn how to sing and learning how to let vibration move through my body. And I've noticed that it's, well, I mean, this should be obvious to any singer, but it wasn't to me. But that the quality of the flow, the quality of the movement really has a profound effect on my whole body, my mood, everything. If I can get open and sing and not feel like a contracted point or particle, feel more like a wave, that has a profoundly cohering effect. I think it feels like on a cellular level, certainly on a neuropsychological level, as far as my nervous system. And to tie that back to the quantum physics, I think I'm obviously a layperson. I'm not a professional. I was good at science, but I didn't pursue it. And I got the notion in my mind, another perhaps mistaken notion similar to the active-passive consciousness duality that I brought up, that waves and particles were equivalent. And this again is from a purely just intuitive place. I've been coming in my beliefs, because that was a belief that I was carrying with me, that the fixed point that doesn't move, that's static, or that moves around but is self-contained, is just another version of the same wave phenomena seen from different perspectives. I am curious what the physicists would have to say about the notion that the wave is more real. Not that the particle is unreal, because the particle arises as a mental kind of explanatory, let's say, fiction. But that the wave phenomenologically, in terms of what can be perceived and experienced, is actually closer to the truth. That's a loaded word, but I'm curious how physics sort of deals with that, because I feel that we work with. It's very different to work with entities that are fixed and that you could kind of move around, or that you could set in motion in different ways, and entities that are emergent or that are entangled, that are interfering with each other always, that you don't experience, but in a state of some kind of interference. John's picture, where he put the musical notations, and one can read a musical score, each of those notes is kind of like a particle, but the actual experience of the music are waves. So a note doesn't have a clearly defined beginning and end. It has a kind of arc where it intensifies and then it dissipates, and the notes blend with each other, and you get this, this musical effect. So this is very interesting to me, because the other side of it is that although we may say that a particle is a fiction, it's still true, and I think Marco Massi, you make this point in your video, that the mental realm arises within the cosmic mind. And so it's not that it's false. It's that it takes a perspective on the other realms, and then we tend to limit our own, let's say, belief structure to privilege that particular realm over the others. And that's what leads into these kind of dead ends and blind alleys, where we end up lost in the notation and not feeling the music, not actually getting the effect of coherence that would come if we were musicians working with perhaps even, you know, a musical score with particular notations, but attuned to the music that's coming out of them.
I just want to add to that. There's the note, there's the tone, and then there's the relationship between the tones, which is happening on another level. It's the interplay of those levels. A note, like you say, or the tone, has no beginning or end, perhaps. Or I think you said it's not clear where the end and the beginning of the note is. The same thing is true of a word. I think, and a collection of words, and a sequence of words, and the syntax that we intuit how to put our words into certain arrangements if we want to make a communication to another person. I think that these are all semiotic questions. The relationship between writing, speaking, singing, and what the voice can do, what the human voice can do, is quite spectacular, actually. And I think that musical metaphors really work for me. They make sense to me. Also, I just wanted to show another little chart. I hope this shows, you can see this image of this figure with the spiral, okay? And then right next to it is another figure with the up and down, the vertical, and the nature of diffraction waves. So, and this is hugely speculative on my part, but it's very hard to put all these models into words, but like a diffraction wave is, so you have a wave like this, right? And it's going this way and this way and this way. And how do you measure that? It's really tricky. And you physicists, please correct me. But Karen Barad said that we look at the quantum level, we look at the diffraction waves. And she says, but if you go to the beach, you can see there are some boardwalks that have been constructed to deal with large storms. And what they do is they've broken up the boardwalk so that it can rise and fall with the waves. So in a way, when you're looking at that boardwalk, she said you could be at this end of the boardwalk or this end of the boardwalk, and it could get going like this. So those both persons may be riding the same way, but it would be tricky to measure that in the subtle realms. How do you measure the subtle realms? What is your instrument of measurement? If you're in a subtle realm, for instance, you're having a dream, and in the dream you see a door, and you want to measure that door. What is your instrument of measurement going to be? And doorways in dreams do not sit still. They move all over the place. And I think this is really problematic. We would talk about different levels of reality, and then we want to reduce all of reality to quantum physics or classical or the new physics. I think it's just a very tall order for physicists to live up to. But I do think there's an attraction I have in language and the idea, and I think you sort of, the difference between panpsychism and cosmopsychism. I think Kastrup has called himself a cosmopsychist rather than a panpsychist. And And one more quote, and then I'm going to be quiet. I hope this is helpful. I'm quoting from The Transcendent Mind by two physicists. Julia Mossbridge is one of them. And they're talking about the billiard ball version of reality, which I believe dominates all of our educations and the sciences and most of the humanities as well. This billiard ball version of reality. It constitutes the historical core of materialism. And the author says, there are several things to note about this version of reality. It is scalable. It is deterministic. This version is objective. It is reductionistic. And fifth, it depends on an absolute space within which all of this activity takes place. Also, time is uniformly ordered from the past into the future in a linear manner and is the same for all observers, an absolute time. So we have a scalable, deterministic, objective, and reductionistic model of reality that depends on the existence of absolute space and time. And they conclude by saying each of these 6 prongs of historical materialism has been pretty much dismantled by now. So I think we're all in a transition. Physicists, biologists, scientists, 100 years from now, will science look like what it is now? I really doubt it. There are new sciences coming online, psychoneuroimmunology, various kinds of environmental sciences. Psychology is changing radically. So I think we're all transitional beings, and we're really up against it, perhaps in a way we've never had to deal with so many conflicts going on in so many different areas. So I think there's a lot to be optimistic about. I think we are immensely creative beings, but I think that potential has, we barely scratched the surface of that. And I think it's very, very hard to find the practices that can actually actualize these potentials because we're living in such a mentally deficient time. Those of us who've studied Gebser know what I'm talking about. Thanks.
I just wanted to come back on Marco Morelli, your comment about fields as having some sort of slightly higher value than particles. It is, I think, generally true, although the thing that particles do that fields don't is disruptions. Fields are continuous. The notion of disruption in a field is I mean, you can approximate it by having very steep gradients in a field that look like disruptions, but ultimately things are continuous. And so the notion of, so in a way, it's the notion of singularities. In a sense, like Marco Masi was saying, a particle is a concentration into a particular location in space and at a particular moment in time. So particles themselves are singularities, and singularities aren't well managed in fields, or they're not, they sort of fall outside of the domain of what you can talk about in a field. So it's that aspect of which you need in addition to fields in order to, so particles per se are not so important, but it's this property of disruption that needs to be added into fields to make it work.
Yeah, I might add to that also when we speak about particles, or generally of matter, we must be also aware of the fact that according to modern science, which is not quantum physics, but it's more astrophysics, that we know only about 5%. That actually the modern science and physics and astrophysics deals, when we speak about matter and particles, we are speaking only about 5% of the known universe. there are another 95% that nobody knows what it is. We only know that it exists somehow. This is so the famous dark matter and dark energy. We even don't know if it is really matter or whatever. So we are speaking about something. When we speak about matter and energy, we are speaking about something that makes only part of 5% of the, and we don't know if the other 95% of the universe, what is that? We don't know much about that. Maybe it's just ordinary matter, but that interacts not only weakly with our matter, but they are looking for that since now decades, and still there is no result. We don't know for sure. But the idea is that it is some form of subtle matter that we do not detect easily. So just, I think it's always good to keep in mind this. Yeah, the point that Marco made about what is more real, the wave or the particle analogy, the point that in quantum mechanics there is even not a wave in the sense that we tend to believe now. When we speak about a wave, we think of a wave of water, which is made of particles itself, but that's not what you have in quantum physics. In quantum physics, you have a probability wave. So what is a probability? When I think of a probability, I think about something abstract. It is a mathematical formula. It is a function on a piece of paper. I don't think that the notion of probability, which for me is an abstract notion, that is a tool with which I make a prediction, how probable it will be that I toss a die and 6 comes out. If it's normal die, it's 1/6, 1/6. But this is a number, it's an abstract mathematical representation of an event. In quantum mechanics, you have this idea, strangely, that out there is expanding in space and time a probability wave. So what is that? We don't know for real, and that's a long discussion. I mean, since the time of Bohr and Einstein, they were discussing how should we interpret this, and that's where from also, well, not only from that, but also from that, if this so-called wave function or the state vector in quantum physics, is it a real object or is it only an abstraction? And there, everyone has his own ideas, his or her own ideas on the subject. And from that, also a plethora of interpretations of quantum mechanics emerged, about which I don't like them very much, because most of them tend to think again in particles, and I don't like particles. But I don't like waves either. So, yeah, you would want to say something.
If I may follow up on that. If perhaps we can draw on the notion of information again. Would it be accurate to associate information with the particles, insofar as one needs to get some configuration of particles from one location to another, and that's the information that travels, and they can only move as fast as the speed of light. However, in the case of interacting waves, where you have an interference pattern between two phenomena at the microcosmic scale, or perhaps at larger scales as well, the human or the spiritual scale, that when we talk about entanglement, that's an interesting other metaphor, right? Because we think of strings perhaps that are knotted together. But what if what is happening there is that there's an interference pattern that's created between the two different phenomena, and that interference is carried wherever the particles, or what we might call particles, happen to travel. But they're in sync with each other because they previously interfered. So it's not that there's a kind of mysterious knot between them. It's that they're vibrating in the same way, although at different places, because they previously had interacted. And so the entanglement that we would perceive to be there, or project to be there, is actually a wave phenomena. It would be better explained by wave than by particles that would have to travel back and forth.
Yes, but waves of what?
Excuse me?
Waves of what? The point is, the question is, when we think of waves of water, of an electric field, of matter, of here is waves of probabilities, probability wave it's called. So that's a problem in quantum. One of the philosophical problems of quantum mechanics is that it is not clear what this wave we are speaking about is really. Is it a really thing? Then you must tell me a wave made of what? What is this entity? If it's not, it's only just an abstract thing. But it's very.
I imagine
tricky.
energy. I mean, it's not. We're not. I mean, we're not talking about nothing. It's a wave of something. So, energy.
Let me just correct your idea a little bit, Marco. One of the ways physicists have formed to understand entanglement is to think of the process of entanglement is they become the same object. And therefore, if you make a measurement in one location, you affect all other parts of that object, regardless of where they are located. So because it's an identification, if you like, it's all the same thing. So this idea of non-local objects, right? So the object is in many places at once, essentially. So there's no propagation going on. It's just the same object that's being changed.
Yes, in fact, and let me connect to this, what you have said now, Geoffrey, to the thing that you said previously. You said, in fact, it's not only about entanglement, it's also about uncertainty, about the problem of coherence and decoherence. And one of the principles of quantum mechanics that I think one of the most fundamental is the principle of indistinguishability, which is strictly connected with this idea of entanglement. It's the two coins of the same metal. Because in quantum physics, indistinguishability, it's a difficult word for me. To say that two particles are indistinguishable in quantum mechanics is very different compared to classical mechanics. In classical mechanics, we think here's a marble, here's another marble. Well, they are equal, and well, but I don't know which is which. Maybe I can label them, but this is classical indistinguishability. In the sense that it is about our ignorance that we cannot distinguish the one from the other. In quantum physics, two electrons are really indistinguishable. I don't know how to say that, because they are the one and only one whole object. And not because we don't know, but because they are one electron that manifests as two electrons when you look at it, when you measure it. But when they are entangled, they are a one unique whole, and that's where this indistinguishability principle of quantum mechanics comes in as more fundamental as this classical idea of things being indistinguishable. And that makes the whole thing more difficult to, less intuitive, but also more fascinating, I think.
I think you raise an interesting point there. We tend to use language in ways. Well, we use language in the only ways that we can. So if Kastrup says the particle's a fiction, we don't think about the particle, we think about what we understand under fiction. If then it says consciousness is an illusion, then we don't think about consciousness, we think about what we mean with an illusion. And the words that we use to describe a lot of these phenomena and a lot of the things that we talk about tend to have negative connotations that end up getting in our way. it's like you said, maybe it is just one electron that's everywhere at once. Well, we don't think like that. That's the part that's hard for us. You say, when you stop and think about, I'm going to say this very banally. If you stop and think about it, well, maybe it is. Maybe it is just one big, books have been written about the fact that we're just one big electron, okay? Science fiction's made of those kinds of things. But when we try to understand what might be happening at any point in time, so, waves. Oh yeah, we all know what waves are, and we have no clue what waves are. But we have a way of making sense to ourselves about what waves are, because there's always waves of something. Even if we know that vibrations interact, but vibrations of what? Are they light vibrations? Sound? Where does sound become light, or vice versa, or whatever? Because we search very hard for some kind of certainty, something that we can grasp onto. And it's really difficult, I think, for us to simply, and this is one of the belief that there's this certainty that we can hang on to. We have to suspend that for a moment. This is why I love literature. You can't read literature without suspending your disbelief. And I think we have to engage life the same way. I think that's the real lesson that literature teaches us. Suspend it for a while and kind of go with it. Let it be whatever it is, and somehow we try to imagine what it might be and what it might mean. And when we engage with others, if we approach that with a little less certainty, that's the problem we have with science. It tends to become dogmatic. It's this way and no other way. Well, no, it's just the way you're saying it. It's the way you're describing it. And I can follow that to a certain extent, but it doesn't get me as far as I would like to go. So I need to find others who are describing it slightly differently to enable me to go further. But I have to walk around with all of these views of certainty, fully aware of the fact, well, not fully aware, I'm never fully aware of the fact, or I'm probably never ever aware of the fact that they're all guesses for the most part. But it's okay that they're guesses, because all of the guesses together can be helpful, even if I don't know for sure. But we have this drive. I think most humans have this almost need for some kind of surety about what it is that they're talking about, but we don't really know. And to be able to live with this uncertainty, to be able to live with the unsurety, is something that I think is very helpful today. Johnny had mentioned before, we're going through a time where nothing seems to make sense and everything is going, and there's this huge transition going on. Well, if I take a Gabesarian view of this, it wasn't any easier for the people, 2,500 years ago that went from mythical to mental. And it wasn't any easier for the people, 10,000 years before that, or 20,000, whenever the hell it was, who went from magical to mythical. Your whole world just gets topsy-turvy. Nothing makes any kind of sense, in a sense that you might be able to make sense of it. And so we have this very disconcerted and uncertain feeling that is very bothersome a lot of the time. But I think at bottom, what I tell my grandson a lot is, well, you just have to learn to live with that, because you're not going to change that. You can't make it any more than it is. We can try, and we can grasp onto things. And the things that I like about our discussions here is that we have a lot of people that are willing to deal with a lot of uncertainties in different ways. And it's very helpful to see how Marco Morelli is dealing with, how Marco Massi is dealing with, how Michael Stumpf approaches this. Because that's helpful. We go, well, he tried this, he tried that, they tried this other person does it this way. And out of that, when I get a little confused and really hard pressed to make sense of things myself, I know there are other ways of looking at this as well. So we're in this process of trying to sort and sift what we don't know. And I don't think at the moment, right at this very moment, we need to know, but it's extremely helpful to have these insights into how it might be conceived. That's what we're doing. We're conceiving it. You know, we're kind of making this up ourselves for our own surety, whatever that may be. And I just realized that I just turned a corner where that whole sense kind of exited left.
I am listening to what everybody's been saying. So here's my belief, putting it on the table, that one of the things that's, I think, part of thinking, feeling, and doing, those three aspects of a human being, the common thing that has come to me is the very erotic intensity of the uncertainty that I have to live with. It's erotic. And I mean that not sexual in the sense of your lower half of your body. I mean erotic in the sense that we're made up of senses and we have sensations, and even listening to this conversation, there was an intense sensation of feeling into the uncertainty of how I was trying to listen to the language of Marco, Mazi, and Jeffrey, and then, you know, everybody there, that I actually kind of just feel into the fact that I think that's all I need to do, not really make sense, but be open to the intensity of the nonsense I don't know, you know, I don't know how to figure out. And I hope that lands on everybody okay, because, you know, from my perspective, sometimes it feels like nonsense, you know, but in my experience, and this is coming from Gebser because I've really latched onto it. I see a lot of it has to do with what has to do with all of us maybe developing the skill of being with intensity, because a lot of people are being intense with no fucking skill of what to do with it. They're just being reactionary, is what I see from a social, you know, reality that's taking place in this time and place. And to me, the word entanglement kind of is a good metaphor for a working metaphor, like Marco Masi was saying, a working metaphor, but it has its limits. I agree. Of me engaging in this conversation from a listening and a responsive way. So thank you.
Hear, hear. Especially the erotic perception of, we can talk about erotic, quantum eroticism. It's thinking we're about 15 to 20 minutes away from the end of the time, and I'm thinking we've had a lot of discussion about spirituality and the relation to quantum physics. But what difference does it make in our lives, this discussion? I mean, is it going to change the way I practice my own spirituality? Intuitively, I think perhaps, but I'm not quite sure how. Maybe I need to come back in about 6 months and talk about that. I'm not sure whether other people have any reactions about that.
I do, if I can just put a quick response. I had exactly the same thought just a moment ago, Jeffrey. And it's a belief, but my belief is that if you firmly engage anything, say a subject, just like tonight in this discussion, and if you sincerely engage it, you can't help but be different afterwards. So it is going to have an effect. Now, I agree with you 100%. You don't know what those effects are. You don't know where they're going to pop up. You don't know how they're going to show up. You don't know where or why. You're going to, I think we're all going to notice things along the line where you go, well, I think I would have reacted differently to that. Why am I not acting that, reacting the way I thought that I would? And then I'll follow up again with what you said. We need to go back to that and go, well, maybe that came out of that discussion if we want to trace the roots. I'm to a point in my life where I'm not really concerned with where it came from. Particularly, I'm more concerned about what effects it's having wherever it is that I'm going. So if I have a moment of calm contemplation where I can look back and see where maybe the root was, that's great and it's very rewarding. But I am particularly interested in what you just said. What effects does it have? And I believe that I'm going to behave differently after this session than I did before it, because I've gained a lot from this. I've got a lot of insight. I've got impulses, some of which I'm very aware of, some I made notes on, and some I believe the most effective ones I have no clue about yet. They're going to show up a little later in ways that are probably unexpected. So I'm just underscoring the questions that you just raised there.
Yeah, if I might give a direct answer, I tend to say that I would reframe the question, and it not if it changes our lives, because I think, as Ed already underlined, in one way or another, consciously or unconsciously, it changes our way of thinking, of what we are doing, or what. So that's probably, yes, it changes our life. The point is it necessary to know these things? So here we have also, I would like to give an answer in this sense. In a certain sense, no. I do this not because I think it's necessary and it is so important because I will have a better life, but simply because I'm just curious. I want to know. It's innate in the human being to be more curious and to know things. That's probably also something that comes from within and makes part of our metaphysics. I think it's our soul that wants to grow. For some people, this is a way to grow. For many others, probably the majority, if they speak about quantum physics, no. But that's fine, because they probably grow with other means that I'm not interested in. So I always say that physics and science, when it comes to these philosophical issues, it's a sort of a game for adults. But is this bad? No. Playing is nice. Gaming is nice. I mean, so it's just a game for adults. It's not something that I believe it's necessary for me or for others, especially not for others. It's necessary for, no, let me say it again. It's perhaps necessary for me because it's a means with which to know if there is a connection between quantum mechanics and spirituality is something that makes me passionate. And why? I could give a lot of answers to this, but probably that would again be fictions as well. I'm not sure why, but it makes me feel good. Whereas it's, for me, it's something individual. I think everything what we make in our lives has probably an evolutionary function. If we put it in very down to earth scientific means, there is nothing that is absolutely necessary for all, and that's one malady of our society. This idea to believe that we have to do things, and to put it especially on the mind of children, because everyone must know this and do this. we must come out from this idea, and then I think we have the question arises in a different way. Yeah.
I'd like to explore that, because I think this the spiritual is evolving through us, and I believe right now, and I do agree that we have games that we play. Physics is one of those games right now, because it's dominated by physicalism and materialism. It's a stupid game. I think it could be a more interesting game. I also think that our evolution, there's the biological evolution, and then there's the cultural evolution. And last time we talked about the genes and the history of the genetics, how it moved from Crick and Watson and the double helix to the Human Genome Project. And there was a total change of view about what the genetic code is and what it does. And epigenetics is now front and center in many geneticists' attention in a way it never was before. So there's a transformation happening in biology. The gene is not now what it was 60 years ago when I was studying biology in high school. I think there's a change too in physics that's happening, which is analogous to what happened in the study of genetics. But I also think that we're all signs. We're dealing with signs and sign systems, and I think the self is a sign system. We have a stop sign. We know how to obey that, but it's a convention. The sign isn't making me do anything, but I know how to interpret that sign conventionally and use it. A book is a text. That's another convention. I know how to interpret those symbols. So we have different kinds of codes, and I think you mentioned earlier, Marco, about cryptic codes and cryptic messages. There are mixed messages, and they come in different shapes and sizes. There are analogical messages, and then there are digital messages. And there's the language that I use, and then there's the tone of the voice, there's the gestures, there's an expression. All of that is analogical, but it is more communicative to someone else than just the words. So it's adding on, giving a meta message or perhaps a paramessage to the digital. So I think this is what many of us who studied Bates, and we focused quite a bit on this. But if you look at animals and humans and the differences and the evolution of biology, the evolution of culture, I think we have to recognize an animal. If you look at a dog and you train a dog to respond to the sign that would be a circle, and that circle would be a command for the dog to do something, the dog will happily comply. But if you start changing that circle into something that looks more like an ellipse, which is an ambiguous figure for the dog, it doesn't know what it's supposed to do. And it will go, And if you persist to give it the confusing signal, the confusing sign, it will start to turn around, spin around, chasing its tail. And if you persist in giving it that ambiguous sign, the dog will bite you. These are communiques between animal and human animal. Now, what's different about us humans, it appears that animals cannot do this. We can work with signs and signals as animals do. You ring a dog and you ring a bell and the dog starts to salivate. I mean, that's an indexical sign. But we can deal with symbols, and that's very mysterious. And I believe this has something to do with where we come from and why we're very, very, very different. I don't want to be a human exceptionalist, but I think there's something different. I'm thinking of a play, Chekhov's play, The Seagull. An actress says at the end, there's a sequence where the two lovers have a quarrel, and the man goes off and he shoots a seagull, and he brings the seagull to his girlfriend, and he drops it in front of her, and she says, "What does this mean? You know, you're acting crazy again." At the end of the play, lots of tragic events happen, and they're separated, but they come back together. And she's had lots of terrible experiences, and she's an actress. She performs on the stage, but her mind is wandering, and she says, "I am a seagull." Oh, no, that's not it. And then they talk normally for a little while longer, and then she goes, "I am a seagull." And I think the audience and the actress, the character, there's something that's happening that's symbolic. She is referencing that previous experience of her lover shooting that seagull and presenting it to her. And now she doesn't say, "I am like a seagull." She says, "I am a seagull." So this is symbolic, which is highly ironic in Chekhov, because the poet who shot the bird is actually a symbolist poet. So it's extremely ironic. But I'm thinking that these are the kinds of differences that make a difference. It's not just information, it's news. And news, I believe, is what the spirit is, what the spiritual is all about. So anyway, thank you for giving me that chance to rehearse that. I hope some of that made sense, and thank all of you for your interesting comments and points of view and your quandaries, and perhaps even confusion. I think it's all very creative. Thank you.
I always, when I listen to you, John, your story of the seagull is so good because you present us with a dead seagull almost every time you have something to say. And it always takes me a certain amount of time to figure out, what am I going to do with this dead seagull? So I can never reply directly. I have to think about what you say and then come back 20 minutes later, or next week, or next month. So I'm not going to comment about what you just said because I need to think about it. But I think the seagull is a good analogy for what you do.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you so much. That's the best thing I've heard all day.
But to come back to the question of consequences, so I've been sitting looking. So I'm reading Staying with the Trouble, and this is a quote that I pulled out from Donna Haraway's book. It matters what matters we use to think other matters with. It matters what stories we tell to tell other stories with. It matters what knots, what thoughts think thoughts, what descriptions describe descriptions, what ties tie ties. So it's sort of informing all of my thinking right now, this kind of. So I do think the discussion that we have here, that we've had here today, is a way of using a certain kind of discourse to talk about a certain type of discourse, right? So in this, it's very much in the spirit of what Donna Haraway is talking. And in a way, I think that the link between spirituality and quantum physics does something similar. It allows us to talk about spirituality with a particular focus on particular issues in spirituality that we may not actually ever address in other circumstances. And so Ed, when you say, we're present for the discussion and that discussion will carry forward and it will have consequences. Yes, that's true. But that is partly the presence of the 5 or 6 of you. That is to say, it's the conversation and it's the presence for each other that does that, irregardless of what we actually talk about. So in terms of consequences, what I'm interested here, I mean, I like that, and that's important to me, but it's also the way we talked about spirituality today and how that carries forward into my life, which I think is interesting. And I do think, I'm not saying that everybody should talk about quantum physics and spirituality. I think that would be, I think there were a lot of people who would say, no, I don't think so. But I do think it is an interesting approach to talking about spirituality, and I have appreciated the discussion today, and we'll think more about it. And dead seagulls.
I hope we have a follow-up, a number 3 conversation sometime in the near future to follow up on this conversation.
Last comments?
I just want to thank you both, Marco and Jeffrey, and I'll say that for my part, because I don't come at this as a scientist per se, but more as a writer, poet, I love the language. The language of quantum physics offers new word combinations that are interesting, perhaps erotic. But that offer ways to think in paradox. That offer ways to think in complementarities and in kind of indeterminacies or fuzzinesses. This is all very friendly, I think, to the literary mind. And so I think that's part of why poets and writers have been fascinated with quantum mechanics for this last century. And on a more personal level, I feel that the education that I'm getting, or the re-education, or the maybe de-education that I'm getting, the kind of unschooling that happens in these dialogues, is useful for deconstructing notions that I've carried with me since childhood, that were inculcated into me in my school, just as a part of going to public school and getting the same curricula that most others in our population have, and how limiting that has become. And so my own desire is to become free of those limiting conceptual, say, architectures, and find ways of continuing to be alive, to speak, to sing, that can express themselves in a fresh language, in something that's new. The news is shouldn't be the same old thing. So that's part of what I like, is the combinations that we're bringing together, because I think when we bring part of the transdisciplinary spirit is that it allows for a creative field to emerge. And I feel that that's part of what we're enacting in these dialogues, and that's part of what is life-changing for me. Thank you.
Marco, I think you gave me a new idea to found a new science, which unites my interest in quantum physics and education, and which is quantum unschooling. So that I will work on that.
I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I will try my best.
I want to say thank you, because one of the reasons I even come here is I'm a firm believer of how much language shapes our thinking, and how well we are aware of our thinking and the language that we're thinking in. Just contributes or conceives how we view the world. So being challenged with different people using language differently around whatever subject, but especially it's interesting, spirituality and quantum physics. And I just have to say, Johnny, your seagull thing, I really like it, but I was thinking of Jonathan Seagull, and I'm going, oh no, they shot Jonathan Seagull. So I really like that, because it really yeah, it was about fucking time that seagull got shot.
I'll post it. I'll post that from the seagull. I actually performed in that play. I played Treplef. I played the guy who shot the seagull.
Good.
Yeah, it's a beautiful play, and I'll send the scene to you so you can understand where I'm coming from. The ambiguity of that symbol.
Yes, right.
So much bigger. Right. She's so much bigger than any. She can't put this into words. So all she says is, "I'm a seagull. I'm a seagull."
Yeah.
And we intuitively get it, but we don't know how we get it. And I think that's what's different between animals and humans, is we can create symbols. It's very profound.
And just to add this, in creating the symbols, there's a certain what do I want to call it? uncertainty of what is that symbol doing to me in the act of creating the symbol.
Exactly. You're somatically, affectively, cognitively, you're transformed if the metaphor is effective. Yeah.
And you're open to it, I would assume, if you're open to it too. So thank you, everybody.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right, well,
See you
bye-bye.
all soon.
Farewell.
Okay.
Till next time.
Folks. We'll see you in October.
Oh, happy vacation. Enjoy yourself, Ed.
Yeah, it'll be a trip.